Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's webinar, Blended Threats, Real-Time Defenses, Confronting the Rise of Identity Fraud in 2025. This webinar is going to highlight some new findings from a report that's produced by Javelin and sponsored by Mitek, and it explores both the immediate and the long-term risks associated with identity fraud that stem from criminals using a combination of both traditional ways of fraud as well as some of the new data sources and tactics out there. So before we kick things off, a couple housekeeping items. I know most people are familiar with some of the webinar components, but all the participants are currently on mute. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, just put them in the QA box that's located right at the top of the screen. Jennifer and I will have plenty of time to answer these at the end. I don't think we'll probably need the full hour, so we should have plenty of time for questions if anything comes up. And then after the presentation, this recording will be sent out to all participants as well as a copy of the white paper that I just mentioned. So a lot of the findings that Jennifer's going to walk through are all in this newly released white paper that you will receive at the end of the presentation. So definitely keep your eyes out for that. It will come from Mitek, but some really great stuff in there. Speaking on today's webinar, we're very excited to have Jennifer Pitt. Jennifer is a senior analyst in Javelin's fraud and security practice. Jennifer led the research and data evaluation for Javelin's identity fraud study this year, and has really gotten a chance to see fraud from a lot of different angles with a background of working both in banks and in law enforcement, investigating complex fraud and money laundering cases. From the Mitek side of the house, I will be your presenter. My name is Carmel Maher. I lead market intelligence here at Mitek, where I track industry, fraud, and vendor trends in the space. So very excited to give you guys a view of what we're seeing here as well. For the agenda today, we're going to divide it into two sections. So Jennifer is going to kick things off. She's going to go through some of the new key findings from the report, fraud tactics, fraud solutions, and then I'll jump in to talk about some of the things we're seeing throughout the life cycle here at Mitek as well, with more of a focus on what we're seeing with some of the evolving types of fraud, including deepfakes and injection attacks. And then Jennifer will jump back on for some of the recommendations about the outcomes of the paper, and we'll go through some Q&A. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer to kick things off.
Yeah, so let's start by talking about some of the fraud tactics. Next. So when we look at the fraud tactics, we look at identity fraud and scams. Before we dive into this data, I just want to kind of set the stage for where I'm getting this data that I'll be talking about today. So every year, Javelin Strategy and Research conducts an identity fraud study. We survey around 5,000 US adult consumers about their fraud concerns. We ask about identity fraud, which is defined as the unauthorized use of PII to commit financial fraud. We also ask consumers about scams, which is that social engineering attack where victims are deceived into providing some sort of information or they're deceived into making transactions. And then we ask consumers also in the survey about some fraud prevention tactics that they think are useful, including identity verification and authentication strategies. So when we look at identity fraud by itself, just the unauthorized attack, there are different fraud typologies we look at. Two of them are listed here, account takeover and new account fraud. Because this is a consumer survey, we typically don't ask consumers about synthetic identity fraud, but if a synthetic identity were used and that a new account were opened in that victim's name, it would fall under new account fraud. So in 2024, over $27 billion was lost to consumers due to identity fraud. When we look at account takeover fraud, it was over half the identity fraud losses at $16 billion. And new account fraud was about half that. And the incidence rates for account takeover were more as well. But just because account takeover fraud is obviously affecting consumers more financially, we can't ignore other types of fraud like new account fraud. We need to address all of these fraud typologies using a layered approach. But first, what we need to do is we need to understand what these fraud typologies are and what the challenges might be. When we look at new account fraud in particular, one of the challenges is there's no historical data to compare against. So things like behavioral recognition or behavioral analysis won't work to stop new account fraud. With new account fraud, we're also seeing an increase of new accounts fraudulently created using bots and synthetic identities. For those of you not familiar, synthetic identities are essentially this, quote, Frankenstein identity that's a combination of real and fake information, or real information from a bunch of different people that's combined to make one ID. Synthetic identity fraud is really hard for financial institutions to combat, because if they detect the fraud, it's really hard to attribute who that identity actually belongs to, because it's culminated of several people. And so with new account fraud, what's really needed is robust identity verification solutions that will combat that. Account takeover is very different. With account takeover, these are verified credentials of a legitimate customer that are being used. And so traditional identity verification or static login process or static authentication processes that are only evaluated during login aren't going to stop account takeover. What's needed is continuous authentication throughout the entire customer lifecycle through the login session, from login to log out. With account takeover, it's very difficult or very hard on consumers as well as organizations, because account takeover usually involves one or more financial or non-financial accounts. So it's very devastating. And account takeover kind of starts this way. So with account takeover, the fraudsters will change some sort of PII or credential on the account to either lock out the user or just be able to use the account further. And then they'll start to access that account. With account takeover, when a fraudster accesses an existing account, they now have access to a plethora of different information that they didn't have before. Maybe they knew your login credentials to get in. Maybe they knew your name or date of birth already. But when they access your existing account, now they have access to that account profile information and other account numbers that are often linked to that single account. So it gives them an opportunity to take over additional accounts and get more of your money. And then unfortunately, with account takeover, oftentimes what happens is these fraudsters will drain your account. So if you picture you're trying to use your bank account, you can't use it, you're locked out, and then you look at your balance and it was, how many ever thousands of dollars, and now it's zero. That's terrifying. What do you do for a living? How do you pay bills? How do you pay rent? And so account takeover really takes a toll on consumers. When we look at scams, which is not identity fraud, it's different, but it's sort of that umbrella part of fraud, that's a little bit different to defend against. Scams for financial institutions, some of that, if the victim is tricked into actually making a transaction, that's referred to as the authorized push payment. So identity verification and static login processes that only authenticate somebody during login are not going to catch scams. They're not going to stop it. What's needed for scam prevention is really behavioral context to see if the victims or the account holders' behavior has changed. And then with scams, what's also needed or helpful is step-up authentication. Many of us understand that with scam victims, what happens is these scammers try to push a sense of urgency to these victims. And what happens is, in the mind of the victim, they basically are focused on panic, right? They have to get out of that situation. They're completely panicked. And so their brain basically says, I need to do whatever it is to get rid of that panic. And so they make the transaction or provide the information. With step-up authentication or adding some more friction in a potential scam, it actually helps break that sort of urgent panic cycle and helps the victim sort of act out of logic instead. So next. So when we look at fraud tactics, they are changing. In the past, fraud tactics usually involved getting information from physical data sources. So a physical driver's license, a physical check. So 20 years ago, when I started in law enforcement, fraudsters would steal checks from the mail. They might steal physical IDs from maybe a car, a purse that was left in a car. And they would wash that check, or they would alter that physical ID. And then they would take that physical object into the branch or through the drive-through to try to use that information. As our information shifted more online, all information essentially was required to be stored online because we're shifting to the digital realm. Fraudsters also shifted there too, right? They shift where the data goes. And what started to happen is fraudsters now would look online. Maybe they used web scraping tools to look online and see whatever was public information about you or information that was leaked from a data breach. They would also pay a very small fee and conduct a background check on people using searches like Spokio or Been Verified, tools like that, to get all the information they needed, and then they would commit fraud. But now what's happening, fraud is now using a hybrid approach. So what we're seeing is these fraudsters are actually getting data and information still from physical documents. They might steal mail, usually, unfortunately, those illustrious arrow keys that people have heard about. And this could be a utility bill, a credit card statement, a check, a passport. They'll get the information and they'll just use the information instead of using that physical document. But then what they'll do is they'll go online and they might look at your social media profile and they'll get information from that. And then they combine those information sources and then they add an AI component. So they add AI tools to enhance their fraud attack. So essentially, fraudsters might steal a physical ID from a car burglary, and then they use technology to alter that physical ID, and then they try to pass off that altered ID. And if that doesn't work, they still have all the information that's from social media that they gained or from the online source to be able to bypass some of the other identity verification methods like knowledge-based questions. And so this hybrid approach really allows these fraudsters to be more agile and shift their tactics as they come up against fraud defenses. Another thing that we're seeing with current identity fraud trends is they're not just sticking to one channel. So they're not just sticking to in-branch or online. What they might do is, again, going with the stolen identity, they might steal an identity, alter the identity, and try to pass that off in a branch. If they're successful, then they might go home and set up a new account online. And so they're using this cross-channel fraud. So what we really need, again, is this layered defense mechanism that will detect fraud that is this hybrid approach and across all channels. And Carmel, I think you had some additional insights you wanted to add here. You're on mute. I think we're just having some technical difficulties here, so bear with us, folks. And Carmel, I can certainly come back if you want me to come back. Yep. So if we go to next, scammers are also, fraudsters are also getting some of this information from scam victims, unfortunately. 71% of those who were victims in scams, so those who lost money to scams, were also deceived into providing some sort of information. The top 5 pieces of information is what you see here. Email address, phone number, social security number. But what's interesting that's not here is that 17% of scam victims were also deceived into providing user login information. And so this information, email address, social security number, phone number, login credentials, they're very valuable for fraudsters because they can use that information to commit additional account takeover, to commit new account fraud, and to commit additional scams. And AI only enhances these scam and fraud attacks. So next, AI is not only enhancing fraud attacks, but it's also raising customer concerns. 53% of account takeover victims said that they were extremely concerned about AI-related fraud, and that was compared with 32% of all consumers. So obviously fraud victimization really affects how people think about fraud and security. And account takeover especially really affects them. Because account takeover, remember, is not just a single financial account. It's often multiple accounts that are involved or that are taken over. So maybe an email account's taken over and then a financial account. Maybe several financial accounts are taken over. And so these victims have already been financially traumatized and emotionally traumatized by their fraud victimization. And unfortunately, when consumers experience fraud, they do make significant changes. Some of this is just to avoid re-victimization. They might add a fraud alert. They might add a credit freeze. They might just stop using the payment method. But unfortunately, some of them also close their account. And what we found is that 35% of fraud victims were likely to close their account where the fraud occurred. That raises to 42% when we're talking about account takeover. So obviously victims are concerned about fraud. They're willing to move their business elsewhere. So what this says is organizations really need to do their best to prevent against fraud. So next. So we talked about the fraud problems. Now let's talk about the solutions. And I keep mentioning this layered approach that's needed. There is not a single tool that can prevent fraud. We need this layered approach. And what we need to start with in this layered approach is vetting and verifying our customers during onboarding, so identity verification. So we asked consumers of what solutions they would find most effective for new account fraud. And surprisingly, biometrics was at the top. 76% of consumers said that fingerprint scanning would protect them from new account fraud. And while biometrics are a critical piece to authentication and this layered solution, not all biometrics are created the same, and not all biometrics can protect against the same type of fraud. Fingerprint and eye scanning, for example, are most valuable to fight against account takeover, not as much against new account fraud, because there's no biometric in the beginning to compare it to. Facial recognition, on the other hand, is very valuable against both new account fraud and account takeover fraud, because it can be compared to documents that are submitted. Maybe there's a liveness check that's done. It can also be used to authenticate an already verified user. And so I think what this shows is that consumers really don't understand how fraud prevention methods can protect against different types of fraud. So organizations during onboarding need to tell their customers about what authentication methods will protect against what, and they need to try to get their customers on board with strong authentication methods like all the biometrics on board, and they need to start those or activate those right away. What happens a lot of times, unfortunately, is people start with passwords, usernames and passwords as their authentication method. And then an account takeover happens now, or new account fraud happens, and now we decide, now I need biometrics. So what we need to do is encourage our customers to sign up for biometrics immediately to protect against future fraud. So next. So again, no single tool will help prevent against this type of fraud, this hybrid fraud that we're seeing. Layered defenses are really what's needed. And these are some examples of the layers that we're looking at. On the left is really to help protect against new account fraud. Deepfake detection and injection attack can also help protect against account takeover fraud. For those not familiar with the term deepfake or injection attack, basically, a deepfake is when a fraudster will get on camera or video and then use some sort of technology to alter that video or camera. Injection attack, the fraudster won't get on camera at all. Instead, what they do is they use software to inject or place a recorded video or photo into the identity verification process so that they don't have to get on camera. On the right-hand side, these four here are more protective against account takeover fraud. Behavioral analysis, which is also referred to as behavioral biometrics, as well as some of the biometric authentications that we already talked about, are also good for new account fraud protection as well. The key for layered defense is we need to keep the fraudsters out. So if one defense fails, the fraudster will keep trying. But if more defenses fail, the fraudster will go to a different organization. But the key is really to balance out letting the fraudsters, or excuse me, blocking the fraudsters, but letting good customers through. Customers are willing to have some friction, which is some sort of security measures or fraud checks, but they don't want to have to jump through a bunch of hoops just to verify who they are at every step of every action they're taking. So balancing that out is what we really need. And Carmel, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry, I was just having a little trouble unmuting, but I think you guys can hear me now. Let me get back into the slideshow. We will be good to go. I apologize for the technical delay. It is Comic-Con. I'm in the San Diego offices for Mitek today, and it's Comic-Con outside, so it's a little bit noisier than traditionally downtown, a little bit extra chaos. But thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you guys for your patience getting off mute. Here at Mitek, we are also very focused on that layered approach that Jennifer was talking about. It helps us to kind of help solve fraud throughout the customer lifecycle. And for those of you that might be less familiar with Mitek, we have a large suite of in-house proprietary solutions that are positioned throughout a customer's lifecycle, which really help us better understand how fraud is moving, impacting, evolving from one stage to the next. So, where we're going to talk about a little on the slide today is kind of what we're seeing at these different phases. From an onboarding relationship where you're meeting a customer for the first time, you don't know anything about them, they're net new to you. Enterprises have the most work to feel as though they couldn't trust them from a identity perspective and a business perspective and a credit perspective. For fraudsters, it's never been faster, cheaper, easier to scale some of these relationships. And just like bringing on a new customer is a big reward for enterprises, it's also a big risk because it's a big reward for fraudsters too if they're able to get access to those goods and services. So here at Mitek, at that stage of the relationship, we have our document verification solution as well as our biometric liveness. And one of the things we've seen recently, say in the last 12, 24 months, is that with the increase in the technology advancements in Gen AI, fraudsters are getting very good at quickly altering things that have allowed them to fail in the past. So quickly making changes to a document or to their biometric components in order to try to pass. So rather than what we used to see a little bit more often, where you would see this instance happen and then if they failed, they would go somewhere else. Now they're staying and they're trying harder to get access because the technology advancements have allowed them the expanded toolkit to continue to try and up-level this game. So two of the things we're finding really important as fraud continues to evolve is that velocity check being one, and template attacks being another one. So both looking at velocity, but from the standpoint of, are you seeing them an abnormal amount? Are you seeing this template or these pieces of information on a document an abnormal amount than one would expect to see? A second key trend we're seeing right now with the onboarding use case is that digital fraud. So when we're talking about digital fraud, we're talking about deepfakes and injection attacks. So more of this new and evolving piece of fraud that we're seeing. And what we're hearing from our customers is that they're definitely starting to see an uptick in this type of solution or this type of attack. Some of them are confirming they see this directly, and others are letting us know that they suspect that this is happening. So one of the tricky things with this type of fraud is it's very good at going undetected. So a lot of times they may report that they're seeing an increase in losses or an increase in what they're seeing with their synthetics, those kind of things. But looking at the how they're doing it, it's a lot of time tied to this new trend, these new trends of deepfakes and injection attacks. So what Mitek is doing to better understand and better improve our solutions with those is we've developed a purple team, which is taken from the cyber world a little bit, but working with our customers directly to stay on top of how this fraud is evolving by testing where we see some of the weaknesses or the vulnerabilities within some of the onboarding, and then helping resolve what it is that might be the best layer of approach for their individual. solution and problem. Mitek also has solutions that sit at the authentication or the account access and login stage. We have both a face and voice biometric. And so what we're seeing here, Jennifer mentioned the increase that we're seeing with account takeover across the board. It feels like fraudsters have really figured out that in some cases, all they need to get access to an account might be a password or might be a device. It could be something as easy as that to get access to someone's banking information or things like that. And we're seeing, I feel, as I was thinking through your presentation earlier, Jennifer, the idea of someone has taken my personal information and opened a new account is very scary. It's a long process to prove it wasn't you and get that removed and all of that situated. But logging into your bank account to see all of your money gone is quite jarring. So it was interesting, as you mentioned, that it leaves with some of that emotional impact, because I do think that that's something that we're seeing. It's hard they have a higher fear of trust afterwards. So as we're looking to protect the account for the enterprise, some of the things we're seeing specifically with our biometric trend, we're still seeing that presentation attacks are out there. So presentation attacks are, the older method of trying to fool a biometric. It's something where you might wear a mask or print out a photo and hold it up in front of the camera. You are very literally presenting the image to the camera to try to trick it. That still exists. We don't hear about it as much in the news or with a lot of the trends, but it is something we're still seeing a fair amount. However, deepfake and injection attacks are very much gaining traction and becoming a top concern. The last section I wanted to talk about on kind of what we're looking and seeing at the life cycle is the payments fraud. So payments fraud is a very broad category. Mitek has a check fraud solution in-house where we have a check fraud consortium that looks at and evaluates checks to determine whether that we believe they are authentic or could be fraudulent. We're seeing, you don't use checks quite as often as you would in the past. However, we're still seeing that check fraud in the US was at $30 billion in 2025 alone. So still a very high use. And I think this is what I was going to chime in with your earlier slide, Jennifer, when you were talking about that past and present form of identity fraud. It's not just, from the fraudsters are getting information from additional sources and they're using it in additional channels. We're seeing that from the fraud side too, of that they're able to pick up new types of fraud and extrapolate information from different ones across the life cycle to expand their toolkit or their fraud capabilities. And the technology behind that is making it a lot easier. So a couple years ago, it wasn't a common practice that the everyday person could put together a convincing synthetic or a deep fake or, replicate different documents or checks. Even, write a script where you have a username and you go through millions of passwords until you find one that hits. That used to be more of an engineering skill that was difficult to acquire. But now with the technology advancements in Gen AI, it's really closed that gap for a lot of fraudsters, and they've expanded their toolkit. So they're not sunsetting any hobbies, but they're picking up new ones, you can say, which is increasing that scale at which we're seeing fraud attack throughout the life cycle just go up and up and up. One of the things that I've always heard in the fraud space is, fraud is usually like a game of whack-a-mole. You focus on one area and then fraud starts coming up in another. Wherever you divert your attention from, it's going to, pop back up there. They're crafty like that. But it feels like with some of these technology advancements, it's moving from a whack-a-mole approach to more of like a dodgeball approach, where you're seeing that volume and that scale and that attack, where the sheer volume is just a lot higher and you're trying to kind of keep above those defensive lines. So that's what we're seeing when we're looking at kind of the life cycle. And as Jennifer and we would talk through some of these trends, it kind of came up of, okay, well, this is what we're seeing from the consumers and how we're putting together these things. And here's what we're seeing from our customers in terms of what fraud is happening out in the market with enterprises. The other thing I wanted to talk on just quickly in terms of fraud trends is where we're seeing some of the fraudsters target the weak links. There's a couple areas that, as I just went through, you kind of know what our viewing areas are now. So what we would be privy to. There's definitely other types out there that we might not see quite as much, but from the Mitek perspective, there's a few areas that we're starting to see fraudsters target as weak links more and more. And it does go back to that game of, you take your eye off it for a second and all of a sudden it's kind of coming back up. One of the big ones we've seen over the last few years is an increased request for in-person verification or in-branch fraud increases. So, we know back in 2020, we saw the shift to digital happen a lot faster than anyone anticipated. And all of the focus went to how do we secure the digital channels? How would we onboard? How would we sign over a mortgage? These kind of things digitally when we weren't allowed to be in person. So we had a big focus on that channel specifically and the security around that channel. And as we focus on it, fraudsters pretty quickly figured out that this could lead that barrier isn't quite there in person. So, if I go into a branch and I'm trying to open an account or deposit a check or pass off as someone else, it might be easier to have my document or my biometrics improve in person than it would be digitally. And when you're thinking about the individuals that would be checking it, that's not their sole goal is to detect fraud. So the technology component, when you're going through a digital check online, the sole goal of it is to say, is this authentic or is it not? For an individual, that would be thousands of documents, hundreds of different types of checks. It would be a lot of information for one person to know when it wasn't 100% of their job. So it really gives fraudsters oftentimes a loophole to see if they can get access in that way. And we're seeing that the increase in in-branch fraud is something that is becoming a concern along with omnichannel overall. The other piece of that, I think, is the social aspect. It's a lot harder to tell someone, I don't think their document is real face to face than it would be in a digital channel when it's going through, 15 different checks here and there and all over the place to come up with that conclusion. It definitely feels a lot more personal. And the fraudster on the other end is trained to get around that and talk through, why it is something that it is real and authentic. The other one we're seeing, we've talked about authentication and the increase in account takeover fraud. One of the other things I didn't mention previously was the idea around fraudsters are in high communication these days as well. So if there is a system or an area where there is a weakness, even if it's temporary, they tend to pretty quickly figure it out and exploit that until it gets fixed. So it's one where the security layers are important. And the risk is really high, both from a consumer experience standpoint, a fraud loss standpoint. There's a lot that goes into recovering from an account takeover that is much easier to try to prevent as best as possible on the front end. And then finally, check fraud. So we talked about check fraud a little bit on the other side of it, but from American Banker came out with a report that 60% of fraud attempts against U.S. banks were check fraud. So from an increase in things like scams and payments, there's a lot of digital payments going around that how you step up a user for authentication and how you pay people quickly and easily is a big component. Check fraud, maybe people aren't focused on quite as much. And so it's something that fraudsters are able to use in order to gain access. One of the things I think that's important for both the life cycle trends of fraud and the fraudsters where we're looking at weak links that we've talked through is that technology component and the advancements we're seeing. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk through some of the trends that we're seeing with deepfakes and injection attacks, because I think that it's one where, regardless of which area you're concerned, it's impacting it pretty dramatically. So when we're looking at people that are creating deepfakes or injection attacks in order to create a new account, create a synthetic identity, access someone else's account, do a fraudulent payment, do a scam where someone could do a fraudulent payment. Deepfakes are driving each and every type of this. And it's one that it's not just one we were hearing from customers, but all over. It's something that I think a lot of different types of fraudsters are taking advantage of in order to see what kind of gains that they might be able to get. The main reason we're seeing so many deepfakes is because they're pretty cheap and easy. I know that's not a surprise to anyone on the call, but it's crazy how quickly they've evolved to become realistic. And there are dozens of sites out there that for a pretty low price, you could, create your own deepfake today. They get pretty specific as well. You can see up on the right hand of the screen here that this one is tied to real-time face swaps for PC streaming or video calls. So something as specific as you want to use this particular item to, log on and fool someone for whatever reason. You now have that ability with someone else doing a lot of the coding and the legwork behind the scenes. Now, we know that everyone that's using these isn't using them strictly for fraud. It could just be funny to prank and see if someone could believe that you are Tom Cruise, or maybe you're trying to test to see how it works. Those kind of things are also very possible. But this level of technology is also available for fraudsters as well. And they're the ones that are going to spend the most time, figuring out exactly how to use it for their benefit. So with our solutions in-house, some of the things that Mitek is focused on and what we're seeing to be the most valuable as we go about this approach is looking for multiple layers of detection. So as these frauds keep evolving, you're seeing multiple different attack techniques. So for example, you see the driver's license, and I mentioned this a little earlier on the life cycle slide, but a lot of times we'll see a fraudster do, if a license works, they're going to use it again and again and again, just changing small pieces of that information. They now have that ability. If the driver's license works, but the face match doesn't work, they now have the ability to continually manipulate that face until they do get a match or whatever it might be. So they're layering on, when one thing isn't going, one thing works and then they layer on another layer and another layer. So just like we look at a layered defense from prevention, we're also the fraudsters are also looking at it from an access perspective. And like I mentioned, it used to be that when you were declined, you tried somewhere else. Like, this gate didn't work, I'm going to try somewhere else. But now you're really seeing fraudsters evolve. So it's less of a picture, more of a movie of what exactly is it that I need to get to be able to get access to what it is I need. So the key item that we found to be successful here is really making sure you're looking at a number of different areas when you're trying to detect whether a digital fraud, be it a deepfake or an injection attack, is something that is coming to your business, whether that's a new account, a transaction, or an account takeover. Wherever it may be presenting itself, having that layered view of not just is this live, or is there a virtual camera or a digital watermark, but is there a velocity that is the frame duplicate throughout? Is we seeing any kind of background comparison? Do we think this image is synthetic? Have we seen it be bad before? Asking a lot of questions in this instance is how you get that picture of that full movie of what actually is happening, not just what it looks like. And I think that's going to be really important as the fraudsters that have that technology to evolve so rapidly to stay ahead of it. One of the ways that I like to think about it is if you were thinking about protecting a physical house, so not just, a digital area, but like a physical house. If you have something where you're looking at liveness and one other thing, that might be equivalent to having locks on the doors. And in some cases, that might be enough for them to go try to see if another door is unlocked. But in a lot of cases now, what these fraudsters are doing is they're just looking for ways to get in the window or even access to the Wi-Fi, anything that they can to get access in a little bit. So it's a different kind of attack than I think we're used to before. And if you're not protecting that full parameter, you're still letting in a significant subsegment that's going to continue to expand over time. So just an example, here we see one of what it would look like to go through a detection check for fraud. And in this case, we had one of our sales engineer go through this process, and here's what their results looked like. So this was, in fact, a real person who put a deepfake over their over their face. And so they were live. They passed the liveness check. They had a legitimate document. They passed the document check as well. But they were flagged for a virtual camera, deepfake detection, image metadata analysis, document digital manipulation, and velocity attempts, because this particular sales engineer had done this so many times that we had now picked up on that face multiple times. So looking at just one may not be quite enough to stop any one process, but that layered approach is crucial for now, and I think going to continue to be crucial moving forward. Okay, with that, I'll hand it over to questions, or it might be that Jennifer has a quick update.
Yep, so we have a question from the audience here. Cynthia's asking, what about impersonation schemes, i.e. a fraud department calling to verify information of fraudulent charges? They speak to the victim and obtain PII to gain access to online banking. Many times they have access, they access accounts while having victims on the phone. Will this activity be detected? If so, what are some of the red flags? Do you want to start that, Carmel, and I can add, or?
How about you go ahead and start and I'll add.
Okay. Yeah, so I think when we talk about scams, I had mentioned earlier about identity verification processes and static login authentication just during login aren't going to really detect this. What's helpful with scams is some of those behavioral analytics, the behavioral biometrics. So looking at if the victim is on the phone with the scammer, they might have hesitation marks with their devices. So it might take them longer to access things they normally would access. Looking at their devices, they might swipe their device differently because they're scared, they're being coerced. They might be holding their phone flat on the table because they're trying to access, and they have it on speaker and they're trying to access maybe an online portal on their desktop. So behavioral analytics will really help detect that. Some of those red flags, again, hesitation. If that victim is calling into a call center and they have that suspect, that fraudster on the phone in their ear, this is where verbal clues will really come into play, and call center personnel need to keep their ears wide open. If something seems off, where somebody's voice kind of cracks and maybe they sound like they're scared, ask additional questions. Don't be afraid to sort of ask those additional questions and figure out why these transactions are happening.
Yeah, all very good points. And I think that's one of the hardest pieces is the scam, because you have the right person and a real person, and that person has intent to do what it is they're coming in to do and say. So, everything you just said, I agree with. I also think that a lot of the enterprises have found success through scams. I know that whenever I'm in any kind of portal, branch, anything from those components, there's a lot of education out there around scams and what to look for, but it's hard. It's one that it moves fast. So I do think behavioral biometrics is a great way to kind of take that detection. Also, I know there's some that do voice, not just recognition, but voice patterns of concern, distress, all of those things too, that have been helpful in call centers. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think so. And we have another question from the audience. For fraud teams with limited resources, how should they think about prioritizing investments in identity verification or other fraud prevention technologies? And I can start with that again, Carmel, if you want me to. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing I would say is we talked about this layered approach. I would recommend getting a solution that addresses every type of fraud. Having this layered approach, many of you might have heard the term defense in depth that cybersecurity professionals use. The idea is to make it as hard as possible for fraudsters to get through. And if you don't have that layered approach, there are gaps in that fraud process. So what we need is this layered approach. But I understand that there are organizations out there that maybe can't have every solution. They're just trying to tackle one problem at a time. So I think you really need to start with figuring out what the fraud problem is in your organization. If it's account takeover, address that. If it's new account fraud, start there. So I just mentioned, we just talked about scams. If your problem is scams, start with a solution that focuses on behavioral biometrics and some of that voice authentication. If the problem in the organization is mostly account takeover, I would focus again on some of that injection attack, deepfake detection, as well as biometric authentication. If new account fraud, is the fraud most prevalent in the organization, I would focus on robust identity verification and document verification, where these AI-powered solutions are actually detecting fraud in real time to help eliminate some of this customer friction. And then once you get that solution implemented, I would start adding on additional solutions. The ultimate goal, again, is to get to where you can have that layered approach.
Yeah, I would agree. And just from the vendor side of things, I know we often see our clients that will use our solutions in various different ways. So maybe, you would do a document check up front, but also if you have a concern around account takeover, it could be a step-up authentication. If you're trying to transfer a certain amount of money, or there's certain things that have flagged that have a high concern, you could have them do that whole process again, where that feels like that friction is needed. So working with some of the vendors too, to get a better sense of, how have you seen your solution deployed that helps check multiple areas, could be a good way too to help close some of that gap.
And Carmel, we have another question coming in for you. For
Perfect.
the check fraud software that Mitek offers, does it have the capability to look at check stock, font size, data placement on the check, or analyze the customer's signature?
So it does do all of those. I was kind of checking in my head as we went through them. So yes, our check fraud solution does do all of those plus more things that pull out the individual elements of the check. It also operates on a consortium, so we can see how this goes across different channels, different enterprises. You can get kind of that history of, is it normal for Carmel to deposit this amount of a check? Is that what her signature usually looks like? All of those things that kind of help you get a better picture of, does this feel like it is a real check? Is it the right thing? And does it make sense for that individual? So even if it's not your customer, I think it's one of those things that, even if it's the first time you saw them, because I have that consortium data historically, you could see that, okay, well, I might not know that's Carmel's signature, but bank A does. And so because of that information from it, I can kind of build on that piece of it. I hope that answers the question.
And I don't see any more questions coming in at this time.
Okay. If that is the case, do we want to jump to the wrap up and then see if any more come in the meantime?
That sounds good.
Okay. I'll hand it back to you for kind of that recommendations piece from that initial paper that we had walked through earlier on.
Absolutely. So we want to leave you with final recommendations, and some of these we've already talked over, but I just kind of want to reiterate them. Organizations really need to invest in advanced AI-powered deepfake and fraud detection solutions. So AI-powered solutions, the benefit is that it can detect fraud in real time. So often what we've seen with a lot of financial institutions that still use legacy solutions or single rule-based detection methods, it's weeks later before a fraud is actually detected. And so this AI-powered solution runs in the background, so it mitigates a lot of the customer friction. So you don't have to stop the customer from doing what they're doing, ask them to authenticate or verify their identity again. Instead, it just looks at things like the behavior of the account. How is the account being accessed? Does somebody change a piece of information or password right when they open the account? Are transactions different than they usually are? And again, technology can help us with that. The second thing is we need to connect fraud signals across in-person and digital activity. Carmel talked about the physical identities and in-branch activity. And I've actually talked to a lot of financial institutions that are having difficulty with in-branch fraud, particularly check fraud and fake identities. People are walking in with washed checks and altered physical identification documents, whether it's a passport or an actual driver's license. And they're successfully able to pass those off because the people in the bank are not trained on how to detect some of this new type of fraud. And what they're doing instead, the technology is not there to detect some of these, so they're still using human detection. So a person will actually hold up the ID and say, "Oh, I think this looks okay." It's very hard now to tell the difference between a fake ID and a real ID, because technology is getting that good. So having the same technology available that is available on digital channels needs to be available in person, and looking at all channels, being able to see, is this person trying to move from in branch to online and see the whole customer picture? That's what we really need. Carmel talked a lot about check fraud. We need to invest in robust check fraud solutions. In your organization, I'm pretty sure that most organizations have a check fraud problem, whether you think you do or not. Check fraud is that prevalent. What happened, and Carmel touched on this briefly, is when fraud started moving digital, data started moving digital, fraudsters capitalized that and went digital. And so a lot of the fraud was going digital. And what happened is financial institutions took all of their resources and put them to digital channels or digital fraud and left analog fraud completely open. So what happened is fraudsters want the path of least resistance. They started committing check fraud en masse, and it is out of control. Many of you have probably heard that fraudsters are starting to steal the arrow keys, which basically is a master key for all the mailboxes. They're even resorting to robbing postal carriers, taking the mail. We're still mailing important documents that have PII on them, and that's part of the problem. We need to be able to have a check fraud solution that does more than just detect the basic check washing, because it's not that simple anymore. Next, we need to use layered identity verification and authentication strategies. So this is that whole layered approach, looking at the customer or preventing fraud from onboarding to offboarding. Being able to detect, again, in real time, whether it's the person trying to sign up for the account is a real person, is it a bot, is it a synthetic identity, is it a deep fake, and verifying whether it's the person they say they are. And then being able to authenticate that already verified user throughout the entire login session from login to log out is critical. Some of those behavioral biometrics that we talked about, that's going to be critical. Looking at behavior in context is also critical. Many of us are familiar with the false positives that we have always gotten from fraud detection when something out of the ordinary happens in your life, like you buy a house or you get some sort of settlement in your account and you make a transfer, and that flags, and suddenly the fraud or AML departments are looking at you for fraud. We have to look at that in context and understand that there are legitimate things that will happen in people's life. And so looking at not only that behavior, but looking at that with another risk factor and kind of then assessing that entire risk picture to see if it's potential fraud. We also need to not forget about consumers. We can't be so focused on the technology that we forget about basic things like consumer education. A lot of consumer education in the past has been long articles that financial institutions basically put on their website. And some of it is very good information, but most of us, unless we're really invested in fraud, like Carmel and I, most of us aren't going to just spend time reading a bunch of articles to know how we can avoid victimization. So what's really needed is new types of education like gamification, things that are interesting, alerts, and financial institutions also need to talk about the fraud tactics, what is going on in the industry as well as the organization. And this includes AI, how AI is being used against them by attackers, and how AI tools can be used to protect them. What we found is consumers who are knowledgeable about how AI can be used to protect them are more willing to share information and allow organizations to use AI tools to protect them. So we need that relationship, that collaboration with consumers. They need to feel like they're part of their financial well-being. So we need to make sure that we educate them. And by educate, I don't just mean put a bunch of stuff on your website and expect that they will find it. They won't. So during onboarding and periodically throughout the account lifecycle, just remind customers, there's education out there. Here's a fraud tactic. Just remind them so it's at the forefront. And Carmel, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that covers a lot, as we went through them, but I think that all of those are important. I think the education piece, a lot of times you see that there's a fear or concern, which usually can be alleviated just by a little bit additional information. So I just wanted to echo that, but nothing additional to add. And I think with that, I mentioned at the beginning, but with our next steps, we will send out this paper and the recording of the webinar. But if there's any additional questions that come up or things you want to reach out to Jennifer or I, our emails are there, and we would love to hear from you. So hopefully this was helpful, and thank you guys so much for joining.
Thank you all.